All right, so let's talk. Yes. I'm sorry? Right, you go into the project. You first create the project, you CD into that project, and then you install it. Right, at the root of that project, you install it. Yep. Yeah, all these commands are always in reference to where the package JSON is, right, which is always at the root. Or if you're in a Java, then you would be where pom.xml is. Okay? So all these commands most of the times are at the root of all these projects. All right, so state and reducers. So here's our component over here, okay, our hello world component. And as we said earlier, it's going to be, for the most part, it'll be a stateless component. Right? Somebody else will be responsible for maintaining its state. Right? Somebody's going to call this component, and through an attribute, right, through a property, right, it's going to pass in as an argument the object that we want to render, the JSON data that we want to render. So who's going to be responsible for generating that state? The reducer. It will be responsible for generating the states that that component is going to render. So here's a simple hello world component, and notice that it's receiving some data. Right, whether it's an object, a string, it doesn't matter. Something that's coming from the outside as a property. Right? Internally, it's not going to maintain any state. It could, but ideally, it's not maintaining any state. And so we're gonna follow that mantra fairly strictly. These are all going to be all stateless, and it'll be rendering something that somebody's going to provide from the outside. So here's our first reducer. Here's our first example of generating a state. Right? A reducer is going to be responsible for generating the state. Okay? And the reducer is nothing but a function. It's nothing but a function that takes some arguments and it returns a JSON object that represents the new state. Makes sense, right? So here's my first reducer. Right, it's a function. Right, somebody's going to call it. How it's being called, we'll see in a minute. It's part of the whole Redux framework. It's part of the whole plumbing. Okay. So here's hello. Notice that we're using ES6. Yes. So notice that we have a parenthesis here. That means that this JSON object is an implicit return. Right, so this JSON object is what it is implicitly returned whoever calls this function. Yes? Right? And so the state that is generating is this hard-coded JSON object is the state. Right? It never changes. It always generates the same state. Right? It always says that the message is world. Right? And that will be forever the state of the application. Right? Obviously, what we'd like to be able to do is pass in some events over here. Yeah? And depending on those events, we could generate a different state, okay? But again, because this is a trivial example, this reducer is generating always the same state, that the message is world. Everybody okay? Right. So at some way we need to somehow we want to take that state and plumb it to our component, right? And that's where the hard part starts, right? That's the hard part, the syntax. Right, so let's take a look at that. So containers are going to be the ones who are responsible for plumbing that state that is generated by the reducer and making it available to our lowly component over here, responsible for rendering. So let's take a look at our very first trivial container. Okay. So here's our container, our very first container. Okay. It imports the React library. It also imports the stateless component hello. Okay. And then from the React Redux, right? This is the glue library. Remember, right? There's the Redux library, and then there's the Redux React library, right? So this is the one who's responsible for gluing these two worlds. And that's exactly what the container is going to do. It's going to glue together the state that comes from the reducer. Needs to now send it to this component. Everybody okay? So here's the glue right? Yeah, so all this code is just to glue these two worlds, right? So the glue happens as follows. Here's our hello, right? Here's my hello component, and the hello component is expecting what? It's expecting a message, right? That's the attribute. That's a property that's expecting, okay? So we need to somehow, tell this component, hey, hello, you know that component, that a property prop called message that you're expecting? Well, here it is. Right, here's the value for that property. Somebody has to send it over. Make sense? Right? So to do that, we're going to be using a function that comes from the glue called connect. And that's exactly what it's going to do. It's going to connect the state that is coming, and it's going to map it to the property that hello is expecting. All right? So and the mapping happens through a function. A function is going to do the mapping that says, oh, look at all this state that the reducer is generating, right? And that state might be a very complex state, yes? It might have all sorts of nested elements, objects within objects, arrays, and whatnot. We might want to massage, right, all that state into something a little more, flat, perhaps, right? Or maybe aggregate a couple of things before we send it over to our lowly hello, right? So that function right here is responsible for doing that massaging of the state that is coming out of the reducer and on its way to the component. Okay? Everybody okay? Right? So this is, like the name suggests, this is going to be a mapper that maps the state that comes from the reducer into the properties that the component is expecting. All right? So the state to property, that's the name, state to property mapper, right? Takes as argument a state, right? So somebody's going to give it the state. This is the state that the reducer generated, right? The message hello, message world or something, right? There it is. So this one is containing the message. There it is, and the response from this mapper is going to be another JSON object, right? It's going to be another JSON object that says, take whatever is in this state. Take whatever is in the state and map it to the property that the component is expecting. The component is expecting an attribute, a property called message, right? And just to keep it straight in my head, I called it the same thing in the state. It didn't have to be, right? It could have said something else, right? Yes. For which one? Oh no, you can call it whatever you want. Yeah, this name, I deliberately named it that way so that I know what it's doing, right? It's taking things from the state. This could be a function, a real honest-to-God function that iterates and aggregates and does all kinds of things, right? And then it calculates what the mapping is, right? This is kind of taking the role of a facade maybe in a design pattern where it's taking whatever is coming from the data model, doing massaging a little bit of the data and then providing it to some client, right? So doing some massaging of that data. Here the massaging is trivial. It's just taking whatever's in the state, right, and setting it into the message. Once this happens, notice that it's part of an argument to the connect. Right? The connect takes two arguments. One is the state to property mapper, and there's another comma. Right? We'll see in a minute what it does. Right? There's another argument here, but this one, the responsibility is to first extract the data from the state, map it to a message, and then pass it along to the hello into the hello component. Make sense? Everybody okay? All right. What else? And notice that what gets exported here is this constant, this hello container, right? And this was what gets rendered as an attribute, as an element, as an HTML element. You render this hello container, and then the hello container renders the internal stateless component. Okay, all right. There's a couple more glue to go through. For instance, who calls the state to property mapper? Who provides the state? How does that get plumbed? We'll do that next.